It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor?
As I'm putting my shoes on, you may have noticed my socks. I sometimes like to wear silly socks. I don't know about you, but some days I need the reminder that it's okay to play. And so as adults, sometimes we forget that, don't we? Don't we? Yeah. And so I sometimes wear things. This has, of course, Pac-Man on it, to remind me that it's okay to be a little silly sometimes. So welcome, neighbors. It's good to be with you today. Today is, of course, Mr. Rogers' Day, and today we hear a little bit of one of the saints in the journey of this year, Mr. Rogers, Mr. Fred Rogers. And there's a few folks in our congregation who are connected to Fred Rogers, know them very well, and so that doesn't make me nervous at all for what I present today. So, we're going to hear a lot about Fred today. I'll call him Fred sometimes. Sometimes I'll call him Mr. Rogers. Let the child in you delight in whichever name you want to choose for that today. So Fred Rogers used to tell the story of visiting a new nursery school, and he would tell it this way. He would say, I had never met these children before. And I walked in, and there was a long stare from most of them. And one little boy by the name of Thatcher spoke first. And all he said was, my doggie's ear came off in the automatic washer. And there was silence, just complete silence. And it was as if, this is your test, Mr. Rogers. Are you still in touch with your childhood? And so, according to Fred, he said, sometimes that happens to toys, doesn't it? Their ears come off, or their legs come off, but that never happens to us. Our ears don't come off. Our noses don't come off. Our arms don't come off. And Thatcher's eyes were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and he said excitedly, and our legs don't come off? And I said, no, they don't. And immediately, all of the other children started asking questions, and poignant questions. It was as if to say, we shall now open the door. You have passed the test. You may come in. So I love this story from Fred. It captures what we lose when we become adults, I think. Sometimes we forget the simplicity and the honesty that comes naturally to children. We hear of a dog's ears coming off in the washer, and we immediately picture a dog's ears coming off somehow accidentally in the washing machine. As adults, we sometimes lose our sense of wonder, and we view the world as cynics sometimes instead of as children of God. And we take this cynicism into our relationships, and instead of viewing others with hope and optimism, we view them with suspicion and derision. Fred Rogers begins the program with that song, and I give thanks for Pastor Michael playing today and singing. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Sometimes we could use that reminder, Christian brothers and sisters, could we not? It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day in this neighborhood. And he asks, won't you be my neighbor? I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. And since we're together, we might as well say, won't you be my neighbor? And I love the idea of Fred Rogers asking, "Won't you be my neighbor?" As he comes in, he changes out of his sport coat into his sweater so that he's comfortable and he's ready to spend time with you. He changes out of his work shoes and into his tennis shoes so that he's ready to be there with you. Some of those things, though, started off as pretty practical when Fred was working as a puppeteer on a show early on in his career. You see, he changed into the sneakers so that he could move around the set quietly. And it became a practice that when he was going to work, when he was going to be with the kids, he needed to be ready with sneakers on. But it became a kind of a sign. We talk in religious circles, especially in Presbyterianism, we think of signs and seals, right, when we think of sacraments. But for him, the shoes and the cardigan became a sign that he's ready to spend time with you, Fred's television neighbor. In the documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor, over here, one of these, Fred is asked the question that defined his life and career. He says, "Well, I suppose it's an invitation. Won't you be my neighbor?" It's an invitation for somebody to be close to you. He said, I think everybody longs to be loved and longs to know that he or she is lovable. And consequently, the greatest thing that we can do is to help somebody know that they're loved and capable of loving. And so Fred always addressed the people who visited him as his neighbor. And the people who would come to visit him, he would treat with that love and that care, that respect. There's a now classic episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and we're not showing any episodes today. You can go home. There's YouTube. Enjoy it, okay? I don't want to break any copyright laws. But there's a classic episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood where we're introduced to the neighbor, Jeff Erlinger. And Jeff is in an electric wheelchair. You see, Jeff had a tumor at 7 months old, which broke the nerves for his hands and his legs. And so he started in the wheelchair when he was about 4 years old. But it's amazing to watch Fred in their interaction. As one commentator on YouTube describes, he's actually talking to him, to Jeff. He's not delivering lines in the form of a question. He's actually engaging with this child. You see, the conversation isn't about what Jeff can do to make Fred's show better, right? It isn't about what Fred, the one who is capable, so to speak, can do for Jeff, the one who is handy-capable, right? That's how we often define ministry, the one who's capable and the one who needs the help. But instead, they're peers, this grown man and this young child. The interaction, the conversation is about two friends spending time together. And Fred lets Jeff, the child, show the things he knows, how to use his chair, telling about his condition in detail. Because you see, it encourages Jeff to be human, to be a neighbor. And so Fred says then, in the midst of their conversation, he says, "Do you know the song that I sometimes sing called 'It's You I Like'? I'd like to sing that song to you and with you." And together, they start singing this song. Jeff and Fred singing together, "It's You I Like." It's an incredible moment. Fred simply starts singing, "It's you I like." It's not what you do with your hair. It's you I like. I love it because in that moment, Jeff joins in. Jeff starts singing along, and it's not just Fred singing to Jeff, it's Jeff and Fred singing together. And in the moment when they're singing, I hope that you'll remember, even when you're feeling blue, it's you I like. It's not the stuff around you. It's you. It's you. And my favorite detail about this interaction, this duet, is told in the aforementioned documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor? Jeff's parents, Howard and Pam Erlinger, tell the story of Jeff being on the show. They say, Fred told Jeff that they would have a chat, and then we might sing a song together. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't practiced in advance. It wasn't all just some show. It was a genuine moment between friends getting to meet and spend time together. I think that's powerful. And it's so powerful that 28 years later, when Fred is inducted into the TV Hall of Fame, Jeff is there to celebrate and to say his thanks. Jeff says, on behalf of millions of children and grown-ups, it's you I like. See, one of the beautiful pieces of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I think, not only was the ability to make strangers feel welcomed as friends, as neighbors, but was the ability to navigate between the real world, right, and problems faced in the real world, and the neighborhood of make-believe. You remember the trolley, right? You all are either asleep or still not remembering your childhood. All right, remember the trolley? Okay, so if you don't remember, the trolley carried you between the two worlds, from the real world to the land of make-believe, and then back. As we'll look at or hear a little bit later, this allowed the show to address really tough stuff, the difficult things, the very real issues of life. But the incredible piece of this was that just because the interactions of the puppets and the characters in the neighborhood, the land of make-believe, it didn't mean that their problems were make-believe. It didn't mean that the interactions weren't real or were just trivial. And nor was the program putting forward some form of utopia. The land of make-believe was not paradise by any stretch. The content of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was focused on the stuff of life. Over the years, especially since Fred's death in 2003, people have immortalized the idea of Mr. Rogers. Even this series we're including him in references him as a saint, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. You see, his persona has come to be perceived as almost otherworldly. He's saint-like. He's so outside of the realm of what the rest of us are like. But we've taken Fred's life and turned it into some utopian understanding of the neighborhood or the land of make-believe. This was true to some extent even during his life, I think. Many of us have come to revere Fred Rogers as living in a way that just isn't possible for the rest of us. Others have reacted in an opposite, even more bizarre way, thinking it impossible for a mere human to be that good. And so they've told stories about him or created alternate realities of what Fred could have been. Countless interviews reflect that people just couldn't believe that he was genuinely like he seemed to be on television, kind, caring, and frankly not in it for himself. And so all manner of rumors developed around Mr. Rogers. Some rumored that he had a different sexual preference, maybe homosexual. For some, this was the only explanation, that he could be as quiet, as unassuming as he seemed to be, that he didn't fit the masculine stereotype that so much of culture had at the time. And so therefore his sexuality must be in question. But this belied a broader discussion in culture and even the church about how men are supposed to be, which was then taken to its furthest extent. Things like, what kind of a man was Jesus like? And so some in a blog post, for example, by Tyler Petty, for a while in the early 2000s, the what kind of Jesus do you believe in dichotomy came to be represented by Mr. Rogers on the meek and mild side and William Wallace of Braveheart fame, right, on the holy warrior side. But this conversation is faulty from the start. It implies that all men behave in the same manner. Men around the room, care to... No, I'm just kidding. We don't all act the same. We have different things that we're interested in, different ways of being, and frankly, Fred's was quiet and unassuming. And so it doesn't speak necessarily to his sexuality. Francois Clemens, who played Officer Clemens on the show, faced his own challenges, being gay and on a children's television show from the 60s to the 90s. Francois speaks emphatically about Fred's sexuality in the documentary. He says he's not gay, But you see, Fred was happily married to his wife, Joanne, for 50 years. And their relationship was filled with affection and joy. And the way that Joanne speaks about Fred is effusive with praise and love and care. Tom Junid, the reporter who wrote the Esquire piece that served as the basis for the movie It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, the one with Tom Hanks, everybody knows. Tom Junid says, I think that anybody who looked at Fred looked at somebody that they couldn't compare with anybody else. And that's one of the things that I responded to, he says. I definitely saw another way of being a man. I think one of love, of kindness, which sometimes gets lost in our cultural understandings of masculinity. Another rumor that developed around Fred was that he had been, and let me know if you've heard this one, a Navy SEAL. Anybody heard this rumor? Yes? Yeah, back there? All right. That he had been a Navy SEAL, a trained sniper with a large number of kills during the Vietnam War. And the urban legend goes further to say he has a tattoo for every confirmed kill on his arms, which is, of course, why he wore the cardigan. But this idea is an extension of the previous one. It stems from the idea that there's no way that Fred could be that nice, right? The persistence of this rumor, though, is quite amazing. It's been disproven in so many ways. Number one, he would have been too old for the Vietnam draft. He was on television for the entirety of Vietnam, by the way. And the most convincing evidence, in case you've not seen it, during an episode in 1982, Mr. Rogers goes swimming at his local pool, which he did every day, by the way. You see him. He's in his swim trunks. No tattoos on his body. Okay? Tom Junid's perspective on this, again, I think is enlightening. He says, that to me is just like a classic example of people looking at Fred in all of his eccentricity and singularity and trying to basically say, well, that can't be. He has to be this way. Boy, and isn't that how we treat each other as human beings? We try to imagine how the world should be, and we try to define how people ought to live. As people, when something doesn't fit within our paradigm, we have a tendency to reject it, right? And that's what seems to have happened in regard to these rumors about Fred Rogers' life. The universal question about Fred is, was he that way in real life? And Bill Eisler, the former president and CEO of the Fred Rogers Company, says the answer is yes. Mr. Rogers really was that good. But I would say that doesn't mean he was a saint in the way we typically think of it. In preparation for the Tom Hanks movie, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, the filmmakers contacted Joanne Rogers, Fred's wife, to get her input. Smart move, okay? As reported in the LA Times article about Joanne, Micah Fitzgerman Blue, who wrote the film with Noah Harpster, said she really only had one request, and that was that we not treat her husband as a, you're with me, not treat her husband as a saint. So the article goes on to express that Joanne was keener on imparting to writers just how funny Fred was. You see, if the couple was out at an event that turned out to be a little bland, he had a go-to way of making her laugh. Do you know this story? He would pass gas. According to Joanne, he would, I'm very well aware that I'm on YouTube in this moment, he would raise up just a little bit and look at her and smile. Only a loving couple, right? I will tell you, I was hesitant to put that story in today. It seems somehow indecent, right? We're here in Christ Presbyterian Church and talking about Fred Rogers. But Fred was human. He was quirky, he was kind, he was quiet, loving toward his wife, caring toward all others, and none of this is negated by the fact that he was comfortable enough with the love of his life to pass gas out in public in front of her, right? And frankly, I think he's somehow more adorable because of it. What can you do? Fred Rogers was no saint in that same way we think of it, never claimed to be. He was, instead, as Joanne puts it, imperfectly human. Imperfectly human. And it's represented through a conversation in the film that occurs between Lloyd Vogel, the reporter covering Fred, and Fred's wife, Joanne. Lloyd says, "So how does it feel to be married to a living saint?" And Joanne responds, "You know, I'm not fond of that term. If you think of him as a saint, then his way of being is unattainable. You know, he works at it all the time. It's a practice. He's not a perfect person. He has a temper, and he chooses how he responds to that anger." And Lloyd reflects, that must take a lot of effort. And Joanne explains then what makes Fred tick. She says, well, yeah, he does things every day that help to ground him. Reads scripture, swims laps, prays for people by name. He writes letters, hundreds of them, and he's been doing that since I met him. You see, this interaction gives me hope to live a little bit more like Fred Rogers, because you see, he was real. He genuinely cared about people. And while humanity swings the pendulum between imagining Fred as some checkered past and then on the other end as being holy, 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 Fred's kindness and goodness was grounded in the real world. In fact, his understanding of make-believe was, I think, more real than any of the fictions people have attributed about him. I'll let Joanne have a good word here. She says, in the LA Times article, she expressed that since Fred's death, he's been placed on an even higher pedestal. And she doesn't like it. And so her response to all of this, he's out there now as somebody who's somehow way above the rest of us. People invariably say, well, I can't do that, but I sure do admire him. I would love to do it. And she says, well, you can do it. I'm convinced that there are lots of Fred Rogerses out there. I think as we transition just a little bit, I want to go into some of the challenges that Fred faced through the show, not just he himself, but the cultural challenges that he addressed as one who lived out of love, out of kindness, out of care. Over the years, my wife Kate and I have gotten into the practice of taking our children to calling hours and funerals of either parishioners, friends, family, those who've passed near to us. I remember a conversation a few years back when a friend asked me why I would take my kids to such places. It seemed that the person thought that kids shouldn't be there or wouldn't be able to take in what was happening. Not that adults can, by the way. But my perspective on this has long been that if we want our children to understand resurrection, they have to come to understand death. And so to do this, to take our kids there, sometimes we have to face the challenge that's in front of us to truly experience the blessings that come through that challenge. And I think Fred would have seen this similarly. Of course, I'm the one talking, so I'm going to say that. He never shied away from difficult conversations in life. In fact, the first year of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood back in 1968, in what seems to be a very simple conversation between Daniel Striped Tiger, the puppet, and Lady Aberlin about air going in and out of a balloon as she blows it up and lets the air out, blows it up, lets the air out. Suddenly Daniel asks, what does assassination mean? For us, that's jarring. But at the time, Robert Kennedy had just been killed. Footage of the incident and the country's grief and response were being aired regularly on every channel. Fred knew that many children were seeing the images they were facing their fears about those images and the things they heard alone, and so he felt called to respond. Fred describes this, and he says, I felt that I had to speak to the families of our country about grief. A plea not to leave the children isolated and at the mercy of their own fantasies of loss and destruction. He said, children have very deep feelings, just the way parents do, just the way everybody does. He says, our striving to understand those feelings and to better respond to them is what I feel is a most important task in our world. You see, Fred always said that feelings are mentionable and manageable. You see, Fred addressed assassination in the first year of his program for children. Most children's television today wouldn't dare do it, and frankly, most of our churches wouldn't either. Fred knew that feelings need to be dealt with, or we will end up being guided, consciously or not, by those unresolved feelings. When we look at the world around us, especially in this divided time, we can get lost in the frustrations of the ways that people are behaving. I think Fred's way of viewing the world gives us a path for stepping back, for searching our own hearts for the ways that we act and why we do so. There's been a lot written about the why of Fred focusing on feelings in his show. Much of the speculation's been about his childhood. You see, his mother was very protective of him. As a kid, he had asthma, as well as a variety of other diseases. And actually, his asthma, I believe, was pretty severe. His family had wealth that led to jealousy from his peers. And Fred, as a child, struggled with weight issues that led to bullying. And there's one particular instance when Fred's ride home from school was late. And I should tell you, Fred was picked up by a private driver and driven to and from school. Do you think bullying happened? One time the driver was late, and Fred got chased down the street by kids yelling, Freddie, hey, fat Freddie, we're going to get you, Freddie. He made it safely to the home of a family friend. But Fred recalls at the time, the advice I got from grown-ups was, just let on that you don't care. Then nobody will bother you. Sounds like advice we'd hear from parents today, right? But as Max King, Fred's biographer, records it, he did care. More than anything in the world, Fred Rogers cared. It was caring that defined the character of his mother, and it was caring that increasingly influenced the evolving character of the shy but resolute boy. Fred never accepted the advice that pretending not to care would alleviate loneliness and pain. There's a powerful interaction in one episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Again, Daniel Striped Tiger is talking to Lady Aberlin about his feelings. And they sing a song entitled, Sometimes I Wonder If I'm a Mistake. Daniel recounts not feeling like he's worthy. And Lady Aberlin sings back that she loves him as he is. And you'd expect, of course, in a kid's show, for Daniel to respond back, oh, okay, I'm good, thank you. But that's not what happens. Here's the important part. Lady Aberlin sings of her love for Daniel as he is, and Daniel keeps singing of his sorrow. Lady Aberlin's love doesn't make Daniel's feelings, his bad feeling, go away. Instead, she joins him in that place of sadness. And the song becomes a duet. You see, the problem doesn't just go away. The problem is joined with love. As Daniel sings, sometimes I wonder if I'm a mistake, and he recounts all the reasons why he thinks this is true. And at the same time, Lady Aberlin is singing about how much she loves him and all the reasons that she likes him. It's almost as though she says, I like you as you are. If we could only help people in those moments of feeling sorrow and brokenness to know that they are loved, it doesn't mean their pain will go away. But you see, the pain is joined together with love. I'm reminded of a story one of my seminary professors told me in describing pastoral care. He said, most people think pastoral care is like this, that it's dark and it's raining, and you come across someone stuck in a well, a deep, dark well. The water is rising, they're crying out, and most of us think that the response is to get a rope or to find some way to help pull the person out of the well, out of their difficult situation. He said, no, pastoral care is finding that person stuck in the dark, in the rain, in the well, crying out, and you get down there with them. You see, the pain isn't taken away. The pain is joined by love. And so Daniel sings, "Sometimes I wonder if I'm a mistake." And Lady Aberlin sings right along, "I think you're fine just as you are." That's pastoral care. That's loving your neighbor. Fred continually found ways to address the feelings people had around the challenges of life. And sometimes this was in order to address injustices in our world. In an episode in 1969, maybe you've seen it, Fred sits down to soak his feet in a kiddie pool on a hot day. As Carvel Wallace, the host of the Finding Fred podcast, describes, of course it was not a hot summer day. Mr. Rogers is taped on a soundstage at WQED in Pittsburgh, and the episode aired in early May, so it was probably taped somewhere around mid-April, if not earlier. And he says, as I can tell you as a Pittsburgh native, April in Pittsburgh is not summer. So why is Fred so hot? Well, it's on this episode as Mr. Rogers soaks his feet in the kiddie pool that Officer Clemens stops by, and Officer Clemens is black. The late 1960s. It's not usual to show black people in authority on television. As Carvel Wallace describes, his role makes Officer Clemens the only black recurring character on all of children's television at the time. And just a few years before this, the height of segregation, African Americans, in 1964, a group of black youth were protesting segregation at a Florida motel by swimming in a whites-only pool. The owner of that pool, the owner of the motel, poured muriatic acid into the pool in order to burn the protesters. On the show, when Officer Clemens comes in, Fred invites him to put his feet into the pool with Fred, a sign of love. And when Officer Clemens remarks that he doesn't have a towel, Fred offers for him to share his own towel. A white man and a black man sharing a pool, sharing a towel on a children's program in 1969. And the phrase often attributed to Francis of Assisi comes to mind: preach the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words. And Fred epitomized this concept in that he never spoke directly about God on his program, though he was an ordained Presbyterian minister, ordained, in fact, to the television role that he led. He didn't ever talk about God, and yet he always talked about God. He displayed what the kingdom of God was and what it was to be about on every show. As you may be noticing already, Fred Rogers' ministry wasn't just about being nice. Sometimes as Christians, that's what we equate how we're supposed to be too. Just be nice. And in the Midwest, we do this really poorly and really well at the same time, right? Nice to the point where we don't tell people the truth about things. But really, Fred Rogers' ministry wasn't about being nice. It was about changing the world. One person at a time, mind you. And for Fred, this was best done through connecting to children on television, of all places. You see, what he understood was that by facing our feelings, we can better connect to others, help them with their feelings, and in turn shape the whole world toward the good. Feelings are mentionable and manageable. I'm going to have you say that with me, children. Feelings are mentionable and manageable. If you take nothing else from today, that's the phrase I want you to get. This perspective about feelings and shaping the world came from Fred's theological worldview, which included the Jewish concept of tikkun olam. Simply put, carrying out little actions that serve to repair the world. And Fred suggests that we all can participate in this kind of work. No matter what our particular job, especially in our world today, Fred says, we are all called to be tikkun olam, repairers of creation. Thank you for whatever you do, he says, whatever you are, to bring joy and light and hope and faith and pardon and love to your neighbor and to yourself. Fred's way of carrying out this task was to engage with the feelings and the concerns of children. But this hasn't always been a priority for most adults. In 1969, the funding for PBS and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funded the educational and healing work that Fred and others were doing, was in jeopardy. Maybe you remember this piece of history. With the financial demands of the Vietnam War, the funding for these companies was going to be cut in half, from $20 million to $10 million at that time. Fred joined others in going before the Senate Subcommittee on Communications to defend the PBS budget. And this video is worth looking up on YouTube or online somewhere if you've not seen it. But it's a famous video now where Fred passionately expresses the value of programs like his before a very terse Senator John Pastore, who was known at the time for his gruff demeanor. Fred begins by building relationship with the senator. He says, connecting ideas of health and trust, talking about the prepared statement that Fred had written and he was supposed to provide to the subcommittee. But he realizes that the senator and all the others have heard a lot of these over the last few days. He recognizes that the feeling in the room is ready to be done. So he forgoes reading the prepared statement and instead just talks to the senator like a neighbor. He says, one of the first things that a child learns in a healthy family is trust. And I trust that what you have said, that you will read this. It's very important to me. I care deeply about children. And in the video, you can watch. It's amazing. You can watch Senator Pastore move from a doubtful, standoffish perspective to one of listening and a hopeful understanding. Fred, known for his ability to connect to children, cuts through the tough exterior of this respected senator by relating to care and love that each of us desires to feel. And this is what he says. This is what I give. I give an expression of care every day to each child to help him realize that he is unique. I end the program by saying, you've made this day a special day just by being you. There's no person in the whole world like you. And I like you just the way you are. And I feel that if we in public television can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service for mental health. You see, in that moment, it isn't about $20 million to Fred. It's purely about two people connecting and sharing in a relationship of care. And it strikes a chord with the senator, who says, well, I'm supposed to be a pretty tough guy, And this is the first time I've had goosebumps for the last 2 days. And Fred does what he does best. In that moment, he connects directly with that feeling. He says, well, I'm grateful, not only for your goosebumps, but for your interest in our kind of communication. Fred reaches out, connects to where the senator is, what he's feeling in that moment, and he asks Senator Pastore if he can tell him the words of one of the songs from the program, to which the senator agrees. The song is like this. What do you do with the mad that you feel? When you feel so mad you could bite. When the whole world seems oh so wrong and nothing you do seems very right. What do you do? Do you punch a bag? Do you pound some clay or some dough? Do you round up friends for a game of tag and see how fast you can go? It's great to be able to stop when you've planned the thing that's wrong and to be able to do something else instead and think this song. I can stop when I want to, can stop when I wish, can stop anytime. And what a good feeling to feel like this and know that the feeling is really mine. Know that there's something deep inside that helps us become what we can. For a girl can someday be a lady, and a boy can someday be a man. And while the song is aimed at children, in that moment, it connects directly to where the senator is. It's great to be able to stop when you've planned the thing that's wrong and to do something else instead. I love the idea that this song, which is really about anger and frustration, it connects to Senator Pastore on a completely different level. It connects to the realization that he's about to take funding from an organization that's doing incredible work. And up until Fred's testimony, anyone watching, anyone there could have told you which way the subcommittee was going to vote. It was a clear choice. They needed the money for something else. They were taking it from here. There was no way that PBS was going to keep its funding. And yet, here we find Senator Pastore chooses to do just what Fred's song records, stopping the thing that's wrong and choosing to do something else instead. The following year, the funding allocated toward PBS wasn't cut down from $20 million down to 10. Instead, it was increased to $22 million. I mentioned earlier that Fred never shied away from tough topics. And at one point in his career, he thought he'd covered them all. In 1975, he ceased production on new episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But the world continued to change. Turns out there were more topics that needed to be addressed. And when a child died from jumping off of their roof to fly like Superman, Fred started production again with an episode on the reality of superheroes. But going back to writing was harder than Fred had thought. A note that he wrote to himself from that time has survived. It reads, "Am I kidding myself that I'm able to write a script again? Am I really just whistling Dixie? I wonder. If I don't get down to it, I'll never really know. Why don't I trust myself? After all these years, it's just as bad as ever. The hour cometh, and now is when I've got to do it. Get to it, Fred, get to it. But don't let anybody ever tell anybody else that it was easy. It wasn't." I love this note from Fred. Feel like you've ever written in your journal and had that moment? You know what you've got to do and it's hard. Dealing with the hard stuff of life is never easy, even if it's for the sake of repairing creation. Throughout the 1980s, the neighborhood had theme weeks that dealt with topics like divorce, death, children getting lost. This is what I remember from my childhood. He continued to take on challenging issues that came up over the remaining years of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. But the events of September 11th, 2001 hit Fred hard, as all of us. When you've spent the better part of your career working to repair creation, it's such a shock to see evil so personified. When he was asked to do a public service announcement for the one-year anniversary of the event, he doubted what good such a thing could do. But who better to provide direction and hope after such a devastating event than Mr. Rogers? Well, after some encouragement from the friends he'd worked with, I would argue his neighborhood, he agreed. Like the response to the Robert Kennedy assassination so many years earlier, Fred was concerned for how kids were responding to the events and the constant news coverage of the attacks. And Fred's 9/11 PSA brought comfort to many. But in a rare moment for Mr. Rogers, as Eve Ewing, who's on Carvel Wallace's podcast, mentions, he takes the opportunity not to address the kids, but to address the adults. He says, it's such a good feeling to know that we're lifelong friends. You see, Fred was talking to you. Mr. Rogers' neighborhood was about connecting kids to their feelings, but on 9/11, Mr. Rogers wanted you to know how to reach out into the world, how to be repairers of creation yourselves. Responding to the events of 9/11 fits right in with the character of Mr. Rogers. After all, he's known for the oft-repeated story of looking for the helpers, right? That story he tells in that PSA. My mother used to say a long time ago, he says, whenever there would be any catastrophe that was in the movies or in the air, she would say, always look for the helpers. There will always be helpers, even just on the sidelines. Because if you look for the helpers, you'll know that there's hope. This quote comes up, especially on social media, every time there's a disaster. School shootings, flooding, tornadoes, earthquakes, even pandemics. People draw comfort from this idea, and they should. The challenge, I think, is that sometimes we stop at comfort. And that's why I love the address from Fred on the anniversary of 9/11. It's about comfort and call. Comfort and call. Those of us who are supposed to be adults, sometimes we're not. We aren't just called to be comfortable. We are called to tikkun olam, to be repairers of creation. You see, Fred's work with children prepared them to face the world. As adults, we face the world every day, but we still need to do the interior work of addressing our feelings so that we can be ready to do the work of repairing the world. For Fred, this meant making goodness attractive, as he called it, and that this was a way to live into the future. Fred says, let's take the gauntlet and make goodness attractive in this so-called next millennium. That's the real job we have, he says. I'm not talking about Pollyanna-ish kind of stuff. I'm talking about real, down-to-earth, actual goodness. People caring for each other in a myriad of ways, rather than people knocking each other off all the time. And boy, if that isn't what we need in our world of division. To Fred, to live in Fred's way of viewing the world, which we've said is possible, means caring for the other, means treating them with love and kindness. And you may be thinking, how is this possible? Even for the worst people in my life? Really? But Fred answers this question in an article he wrote before he died. He says, but how do we make goodness attractive? By doing whatever we can to bring courage to those whose lives move near our own. by treating our neighbor at least as well as we treat ourselves and allowing that to inform everything that we produce, everything that we create. For him, that meant television and reaching out to children. But for us, everything we produce means everything we say or do in our lives. Living in a way that repairs the world shouldn't just happen in times of crisis. It need not take a mass shooting, a politicized death, or a pandemic to make us feel compassion toward our neighbors. It shouldn't take war for us to care what's happening across the world. It starts by caring for the person that's right next to you, and then the next person, and then the next person, and then the next person. Amy Hollingsworth, in her book, The Simple Faith of Mr. Rogers, expresses a number of lessons that we can glean from Fred's life. She focuses on the importance Fred gives to some things that should sound familiar, O Christians. Silence. Prayer. Noticing the Holy Spirit. Being authentic. Caring about your neighbor. Forgiving. Addressing the needs of the least of these. Confronting difficult times. And the connection between our life now and our life in heaven. This is what Fred Rogers' spirituality was about. And it's also who he was in his everyday. And I love this list because if you peek into Fred's faith, you see he was normal. He was human. He was just like us. I can't recommend Hollingworth's book enough because it gives you a peek into the humanity of Fred in regard to how he viewed his connection to God. Was he perfect? No. Did he have doubts? Absolutely. But did he keep going despite these doubts? You better believe it. And each day he tried to live in love. Many have come to know the story of Fred's appreciation for the numbers 143. 143. For Fred, those numbers meant, I love you. In that the numbers equaled the numbers of each word. 1 for I, 4 for love, and 3 for you. And for most of his adult life, Fred weighed 143 pounds. Each morning he'd get up, do his swimming, get on the scale, and he'd smile because the numbers 143 were staring back at him as though God each morning was saying, I love you, Fred. The disciplines and practices of Fred's life were all about loving, caring for the neighborhood. And for Fred, the neighborhood extended to the whole world. On Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, they often sang the song, There are many ways to say I love you, as if to remind the neighbors, all of us, that we're called to love. And we can all show and feel love in various ways. Fred's ministry, frankly, I think Fred's life was all about love and a care between people. And Fred was often asked to speak at college commencements. Videos of these can be found online too. And in most, he would speak about a powerful idea from a children's book that shaped his life. What is essential is invisible to the eye. After all we've heard today and we think about Fred's life, it's amazing to know that Fred faced criticism. And we could spend a whole class on dealing with that. But the criticism Fred faced was more because people couldn't understand his message for themselves, for love, for care. And so I'm going to invite you, as we get near to close today, into the exercise that Fred would do regularly when he gave speeches, the one that he would do at commencements, the one that he would do in other groups that he would speak to. I'm going to ask you in just a moment to close your eyes. And I'm going to give you a minute. I'll watch the clock, don't worry. To think of someone who has shaped your life, who's impacted you. They may be living, they may have passed on, someone that shaped you into who you are today. And I want you in that time just to reflect on that person and to find a way to give thanks for that person. And so, if you would, yes, you at home too, take just a moment and reflect on that person. I'll bet that that person, whomever they are, wherever they are, appreciates knowing that in your quiet times of appreciation that you think about them. Let us close in prayer. God of grace, you have blessed us so richly. You've given us witnesses, saints along the way who have pointed to you, sometimes with words, and sometimes not. We give thanks today for the life of Fred Rogers, for his ministry to children, for his ministry to us. Lord, may we not limit ourselves to just reflecting kindly on his words and his ideas, but instead to live them out as repairers of creation, following you into the world. Lord, we give thanks this day. In Jesus' name, amen. One final thought. Friends, it's you I like. Thanks be to God. Amen.